All right. All right, let's get this bad boy started. Welcome to another exciting installment of the Chapter 170 Subcommittee, or as I'd like it to be known as the Task Force. I'd like to thank you guys for being here, of course, and Tom and Charlie Janelle had sent us an email. Did you guys both get a chance to review that email and see the flow chart and some of the other recommendations? Yeah. So I think that's where we should start with tonight. And then after we can hit the flow chart, I think we tackle that first, and then we'll go on to the next document. And then we can talk a little bit more about definitions and what we want to do with definitions. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Good.
All right. Janelle, would you mind sharing the flow chart for us, please?
Sure. Actually, Tom put a presentation together, so.
Oh, by all means.
Is everybody seeing it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So
There we go.
And Janelle, this will be posted later, will it?
Yes. Yep. On the subcommittee,
Mhm.
subdivision code subcommittee webpage.
So should I take it from there, Janelle?
Go for it, Tom.
All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. So I put together this presentation to try and address, follow up on some of the thoughts from last week and suggestions on the review process. And we talked about standards and guidelines. So I wanted to jump into that, but just give an overview first on the review process itself. It's one of the things I wanted to say to begin with. It's common to evaluate and refine the processes. It doesn't mean that the current ones are faulty. It's really the municipality, the city in this case, is trying to keep consistent with its policies in a lot of emerging conditions. So this is a common and a very responsible activity for any municipality. Usually what we look at when there's already a good process in place, the changes we look for are refinements or ways to make the process more responsive, efficient, or effective. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the context and purpose because it's useful for the direction going forward. But basically, the review process works under the planning program, which starts with the comprehensive plan that establishes policies, land use, housing, transportation, resources, and community facilities and services. So they're the policies. The zoning ordinance is basically the what and where. It implements the uses, the list of uses, and the scale and where they're located at. Those are the districts. And then the subdivision review process generally is the how. How do you deal with development moving forward where's it going to go and what's the process and what's the applications take forward. Under this process too, the Planning Commission typically has two primary roles. The first is defining the standards and guidelines that are used. And another big one is reviewing plan submittals with those standards and guidelines. So that's the first, just to put things in context, that I wanted to mention. Janelle, if you can hit the next slide.
Hey, Tom, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, Jerry, or Charlie.
Yeah, I feel like the comprehensive plan has been brought up as like a be all and end all when we're talking about specific locations and developments. And I never quite understood that. And I think I understand that maybe that's not correct because it's kind of an overarching view of, future planning around the city.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'll get into it a little bit. Some plans are much more detailed, and that in those cases, you don't have standards and guidelines as strongly as in the ordinance. They draw right from the plan. One of them is Maryland. It has smart growth. So you typically see an ordinance or subdivision ordinance, and a lot of the reviews are more streamlined because the policies are set out in Maryland's state plan.
Gotcha.
But in other communities where the plan sets the policy, but not specific directions, You see the ordinance has more standards and definitely the subdivision ordinance has more standards and guidelines. But we'll talk more about that moving forward. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is important. I think we should look at it now. And then we should come back at the end of this process and revisit it and make sure if we make any significant refinements, it addresses this. This is almost like a mission statement, so it says a lot. Just go through it quickly. It's the purpose is to assure sites are suitable for development purposes, different types of land uses. They're properly prepared for human habitation and provide harmonious development for the city. And then it talks about almost getting into some of the purposes for the coordination of existing streets with proposed streets, parks, and other features of the city, plan for streets and alleys, for adequate open areas for traffic, recreation, light, and air, and for proper distribution of population, all tied back to the comp plan, and also other state and federal initiatives for cities like Lewis. So that's an overarching purpose statement. That's what's in the code right now. I want to go to the next slide, and maybe we'll come back to this before we leave this part, but I looked on the American Planning Association. They have pretty good guidelines for this, just to see what others are doing. So this is a good cross section. This applies for the subdivision ordinance review, the design review, but also standards and guidelines. Again, something we can revisit again, but basically they're saying that in these, there's broad themes by community and it varies by community. So some communities have certain sets of processes and guidelines and others use different ones, but there are some broad common themes, and that's what they're showing here. One is that the process and guidelines and standards ensure a proposed project takes into consideration its surroundings. And that's a big statement. And they went on to say that it doesn't mean that it matches it or even that it's compatible. It just needs to take it into consideration. What are the patterns around it or the policies for that area? And we'll talk about that more as we move on. Proposal positively enhances the adjacent public realm. That means the spaces between the buildings comprising streets, sidewalks, public spaces, parks, and trails, or public buildings. It strengthens the vitality of the neighborhood, district, or corridor, meaning it's not just in the property lines of the proposal that you have to look at the impacts. Definitely allows for public comment, both at the time you're setting these standards and guidelines and then during the development review. So that's important that public's involved. And then it creates a vibrant, dynamic, and appealing place to live and work. That last one, it's where you get into maintaining neighborhood character. And another big one is increasingly in protecting environmental assets. So we'll talk a lot about this. But in a nutshell, what you really are trying to do with this is make good land use decisions as part of your planning program. That's what the purpose statement's about. And all of these, it's really to bring together the stakeholders, meaning the applicant, municipal officials, and the public, and try and arrive at the best decisions for development in your community.
Hey, Tom, can I interject something at this
Sure.
point?
Add for questions before we move on.
I feel like mostly over the last 15 years, where the planning commission has gotten into like little issues with a proposed development would be mostly related to, I don't even know what the number is, those 26 items that are listed in our code that are, most of those are pretty subjective things. And I feel like these are too. I feel like these bullet points you have are too. So but I know it can't be black and white either, you know, it just,
and we're going to get to that, Charlie, is,
okay.
You know, there's with standards and guidelines, there's intents with those. And that's what I think a lot of those 23 or whatever considerations are, is the intent, not necessarily the exact standard or guideline. They're important, and we'll talk about them, about the flow and how they're used as we go on. So it's a good question. We'll touch on it later. Nancy, did you have something to bring up too?
Yes, it actually echoes a bit of what Charlie has said. You know, when I look at this, you know, when we talk about vibrant, dynamic, and appealing, strengthen the vitality. These are all incredibly subjective things. And yet I feel that when we're usually reviewing something, it's reviewing it against the code that, isn't very subject, for the most part, isn't very subjective. So I'm a little confused by how these two come together, because to vote against something, you need to state a reason, and a purely subjective reason doesn't always seem to be appropriate.
Right. And I think, again, we'll look at these moving forward. If it was just this, if these were standards, they wouldn't work at all. They're not objective. But what we'll find out as we move forward is that some things can be objective or measurable and some things can't. So usually a review process is using the combination of those, even for the same type of thing, like context sensitive transportation or development or things like that. Some of it is measurable and some of it's not, but they're both important. And I think we're looking at ordinances need to be prescriptive where they can be to be consistent. But if they're too prescriptive, they could impede good design. So it's a careful balancing act. Those are all good points, and I think we'll come back to them as we talk through this part of the presentation and then going forward looking at them. Anything else on the purpose? That we're going to move into the process, the next part. Back up one slide if you could, Janelle.
Sorry.
No problem. Let me get up with my notes too. So under the design process, just to point out here, there's different types to look at. You'll see that in Lewis too, that some communities, there's only one type. So they break them down here. And this is when I say the type, it's the review is where the decisions are made. So it's varies by community. Then there's different levels of review based on staff, appointed commission, or a board or council level decision. And they're used in different ways, sometimes exclusively in one community, either at a staff level or commission level or board level, or they're a hybrid. A staff level means it's, they're getting the application, they're doing the review, they're using criteria and essentially approving it or denying it. And there's not, I think that in Lewis and surrounding communities, you don't see that too often, except for very streamlined operations, like some communities, maybe the county for lot line revisions and all, it can be done at the staff level exclusively, but you don't see that too much in Lewis. We have, the city has streamlined some things, but they're still, the staff is used at the initial review, but not exclusively making decisions on it. At the commission level, those are typically used in where, when I say level, meaning the decisions are, the reviews done by the commission and the decisions are made at the commission level. You see those typically in larger communities, again, like a county or a larger city that's doing it, or communities that have very specific adopted policies that can be applied rather uniformly. And again, I mentioned Maryland, some other places do that where they have very specific standards that a proposal could be weighed against. And then there's the board or council level, and they're commonly used for local communities where they don't have maybe as many development applications, or their adopted policies rely on findings as opposed to strict standard or very prescriptive standards. I think that's what you were talking about earlier, Charlie, that our comp plan doesn't have, it has guidelines, but not very explicit standards.
Yeah.
But again, it's more common to see these as a hybrid. And that's what we'll look at in the next, Janelle, if you can advance the slide to the process. So our process, we're looking at here, the flow diagram we've all seen before is for major subdivision. There's also flows for minor subdivision and site review. We're going to just discuss major subdivision, although some of these things could apply to the other ones as we look at them, especially the standards and guidelines later on. This is a hybrid approach. You're seeing that the staff levels involved at the preliminary consent and final, where they're reviewing it, but they're not making decisions on it except to whether to move forward to the next step. Under the current review process, preliminary consent, the planning commission is making the decision on whether it's approved with approval or approval with conditions or denial. And at the final stage, the council's making the decision. I just wanted to touch on a couple objectives at this point too, and not so much of this City of Lewis flow, but this workflow of a preliminary and final is rather common. This is what you see more often than not, as opposed to just one review by a commission or something. Usually when you have this preliminary stage, the objectives are to increase the awareness of the applicant's proposal, the public responses, the standards and guidelines, how they're applicable to it. Also to engage any of the stakeholders in public, to identify opportunities or gaps, to hone in on a single conceptual design, and to provide recommendations from the agencies or the specialist to whoever's doing the review, and then to provide direction for the final plan. So that's generally, in general terms, what preliminary reviews objectives are. Whereas the final review or final plan is to review and verify that the final plan complies with standards and guidelines of the ordinance, and that all required permits are provided, and to address improvement strategies and timetables agreements before moving in to the construction phase. So I wanted to cover a few observations to look at too. So can you just click once for me, Janelle? Should pop up a star. One of the things that we're hearing based on experience and just seeing the process applied, that even though this is preliminary phase, there's a perceptions, I'll call it, that if it gets to final approval on a preliminary consent, it's fait accompli. The plan's approved and nothing's going to change with it. I think that's unfortunate because it can rush to judgment on some things and maybe be inconsistent with some of the guidelines that I just talked about, increasing awareness and gathering information. But generally what I've heard in the past, and I've heard even some of the things going into this process, that we need to look at preliminary consent, and we talked about changing it to, I believe, preliminary review at the last meeting, just changing the title, but also I think go a little bit deeper than that. The next thing, if you click it one more time, Janelle. Important subject matter experts input comes later after preliminary consent. So I think we've heard that things like the conservation, the stormwater and erosion and sedimentation plans aren't done at preliminary consent. If there's in the floodplain, we're not getting perhaps enough detail from reviews that could happen or other things. So I think that's another thing to look at or a consideration, especially if, as I said, the first thing is that there's almost, some people feel that there's a perception the plan's approved at preliminary consent, yet we're getting really good agency input that we need till later on. And the last thing, if you click it one more time, Janelle, is that City Council, who needs to make the final decision, is not directly involved in the process until the very end. I think that would be helpful if they're more involved further up front to help interpret or look at preliminary review and help participate in the process. Those are just observations. And I think if we go to the next slide, unless there's questions on this, we'll talk about it because we're going to look at some of the considerations. So this is what Janelle sent around in the draft email. This is a draft. It's something to for us to engage in discussions and talk about. It's, you know, it's just some things to look at of a different types of alternatives. So in this one, as you can see, if you click it once, Janelle, it's not called preliminary consent, it's called preliminary review. And I think we touched on that before. I would say that we're looking at going a bit deeper with that and I'll talk about it in a couple minutes. But as you click the next one, it's saying that we're trying to look at including more preliminary reviews at the preliminary review stage. Said that twice. It's to get some of these reports, at least initial reports on the initial design from agencies. I think, and I think that others would agree somewhat that if you don't do that, you could end up redoing it at the end and causing expensive delays and in the process and some frustration of just getting some early input into a concept. It's not the full engineering plans or anything like that, but meeting with some of the people, the agencies who can provide the guidance. It's not required right now. It's encouraged, but I think that our process could be strengthened by having that information, more of that information up front. And lastly, it's to, if you click it one more time, is to alter preliminary review by having city council in the review approval process following planning commission recommendations. So those are the three big changes in terms of the review process. And I'm interested in maybe some discussion on the review process before I jump into design standards and guidelines in the next slides, or any questions that you have.
I have a question on when you're talking about the pre-application meeting. Are those required for the applicant, or that's just what you were talking about being recommended?
I'd actually like to jump in on this one. I would actually like to make it required.
So that's what I know this has been discussed. I think, I can't recall which meeting. I'm not that good, but I think we've talked about this in some of the chapter 170 issues have come up in other areas of work. So do you find like making it required? I was thinking maybe if it was someone who submitted applications before, like, do you have problems with people, the developers that do you do a lot of business with the same developers? Like, do you have a lot of repeat clients, so to speak?
We do. There's a lot of like the same engineers over and over again. But I think where this comes into helpful is when we have, even though we're talking major subdivisions, just getting we've had a couple of minor subdivisions come in and I'm still working with somebody who's trying to get a site plan in. And if he had talked to me first, he would have been much farther along than where he is now. Because now he's got to go kind of backwards instead of, hey, talk to me first. I can tell you step by step how you need to get who you need to talk to and what you need to do. And then it can come back together. And a pre-application meeting is kind of standard from places I've worked. It's actually really standard. I know places who charge for it, and I was like, you're not getting that application until we know you've made that pre-application meeting. I know places where the pre-application meeting can also include other agencies, which sometimes can be a little bit more difficult. But I think it's a really good first step to catch some of those red flags before they even get into the door.
And John, it's also it's a two-way street in that at the pre-application meeting, the city and the Board of Public Works would begin to understand the proposed project from the developer and the developer's engineer, so that when it is submitted, some things that might have been questions have already been discussed. And that really helps the process and the efficiency of the process. I know we do that GMB when we have to get like a DELDOT permit or an SCD permit for any particular project. We always schedule a preliminary meeting with those agencies to review what we're going to do and get their input. And it always helps from the developer's perspective. They're going to like it, I think, because it's going to help because of what I just said. The city's going to understand the project way better through that pre-application meeting.
It's puzzling to me, though, why someone wouldn't do this. And I mean, it seems like it is of benefit to both sides. So why are they reluctant to do it, Janelle?
Well, one, currently it's not in the code, and I've dealt with other developers who just, this is what we want to do. We want to get this through, and I think it just, but once you kind of just start, you get it into place, they understand, and it's like, we're just here to have a conversation to make your process go smoother. That's the intent is, okay, is Charlie noticing something that, oh, he's got to go back and double check. Am I notice something in the code that it's like, hey, you might want to check on that. Or it's like, we know it's like, hey, this is coming up, you're in this area, take a look at this. It's just, most people like it and it's very helpful. Some people it's like, it's just a step in the process, but mostly they do like it and it's helpful. It's just, I don't think it's ever been done here. So it's just something new.
And who would you require to attend?
So
I'm just trying to
definitely
think of how you actually put this into, writing.
So actually we can just say we can require a pre-application meeting between the applicant and staff, and then we can just leave it broad, because that way if I want to make sure Charlie's involved or BPW is involved, and then sometimes I've had meetings in other places where it's like the engineer, the architect, the developer, the property owner, are all at a table, and we're all talking. And it's like, have you talked to this person? Have you talked to that state agency? And it's just a conversation. And I think something else we can do is like, hey, if we can get somebody from the conservation district or fire marshal on the phone or in person, or it's like, hey, make sure you're talking to them, and we want like the letter like we get now from BPW says they have the ability to serve. But I think what we want is, have you actually talked to them? And, like what we're asking for is like, we want to know you've had that pre-application meeting.
It actually makes
Go ahead,
sense
John.
and is kind of, oh, I'm sorry, Joe. I didn't mean to step on you. Go ahead.
No, John, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say it's in keeping in theme with wanting to have the mayor and city council hold a public hearing and have their input a little bit sooner. It sounds like we just need to have a little more input with these developers earlier in the process.
Agreed. Yeah, I think to Nancy, your point, I think what I've heard before from some applicants is that they want more direction on the layout of the street and the lots to go and talk maybe to other agencies. They're reluctant to go to the conservation district until they know more about that. But I think sometimes that the drainage of the site will dictate the layout of the road and the lots somewhat. So it's the chicken and egg. We're not looking at, I think, doing detailed engineering to take and have discussions. We'd like them to talk about maybe the general site, the soils, some of the newest treatments that are out there with all the agencies that are involved, and have an initial discussion that might lead them to better designs early on instead of doing engineering and then redoing it. That's what I've heard somewhat in the past. I don't know if it explains it fully though.
And when we talk about getting more reports in earlier, obviously we're dealing with other agencies that have their own rules about when they're doing a review. And in some cases, I mean, I know we talked last meeting about, this catch-22 where they require, I can't remember even the situation where they were requiring us to do something, we were requiring them to do something, and we.
It was a Del Dot entranceway.
Exactly, the Del Dot entranceway. Thank you, Joe. So as we talk about trying to get some of these other reports in earlier, do we know where we might be running into issues in terms of the producers of those reports wanting us to first do some things before they produce their report?
Well, like with Del Dot, I think they can't issue a permit until final plan approval, but there's a lot of room for discussion ahead of that.
And I've worked in a couple different places, and they've called it development advisory groups, development advisory committees, and it's like, an application comes in, it gets sent out to different agencies, and then they just send comments back. So based on that preliminary review, so if we beef up like the preliminary review requirements and go, this is kind of what we're looking for, and then it goes back out and it goes to everybody, and then we can just go, okay, I need public hearing, I need comments back by this date. And with the understanding, it's like, it's not going to be a full review. It's like, it's just going to be like, okay, this needs to be fixed. You have to do this. So I kind of, and I think of it as like my review letter. It's like, okay, if it's in bold, you got a big problem. You can't go to planning commission. Something's not meeting code requirements. Like you've got a lot that doesn't meet lot size. That's not going to planning commission because they can't even consider that. And the rest of it is just kind of smaller stuff that needs to be addressed before final. So I think you could get comments like that, and then we could put all of those comments kind of together into a packet. So you're seeing those. We'd have to do some reach out on our end to work with those agencies to see how they would feel about that, and best way who could help with that.
Question about all that, because I like the way this is set up. I think it strikes a balance with regard to what you were talking about before, Tom, the fait accompli feeling that people get from the preliminary review approval or consent approval right now. But in this case, we definitely are asking for more information from agencies that's going to push that, oh, it's getting approved during the preliminary review process, but you're also sticking in 2 public hearings for everybody to have their say. So I like striking that balance some, because we have run into that where we need more information from the agencies prior to pushing preliminary to the final process.
I think another aspect is that preliminary application meeting, a lot of times what happens when they're in place is that an applicant can't submit their application until they've checked off that they've had that. So it's almost like a step. It's not an approval of the development, it's an approval to go to the next step. And I think that that's important too for preliminary review, to try and understand it as it's not approval of the development, it's approval to move to the next step, which is final plan approval.
Yeah.
And I think if we can not just change the name to preliminary review from preliminary consent, but make sure that everybody's understanding that this is a process that you go through. There's different levels. So approval does not confer approval of number of lots or a specific layout. It confers that you can move to the next step. And what goes along with each of those is recommendations. So there's recommendations that are based on the code, the plan, the zoning ordinance, and the standards and guidelines that we'll talk about here briefly, shortly. Any more thoughts on this part?
Well, I'll only say that on the construction review segment of this, that I still need to look at that part of it, and probably will offer some comment, because one thing that always gets created is a development agreement. And frankly, sometimes the development agreement doesn't match the requirements of the construction portion of the subdivision code, which can create some problems. So I need to look at the code part of it to make sure if I have any comments on how it really operates, I want to make sure you guys get those for consideration.
Yeah, I didn't even touch that section. I was just taking care of like the preliminary and the final process, because I'm guessing you might want to have like a closeout process and a bonding process and like maybe a notice to proceed process, Charlie, that might need some changes to.
Yeah, I think there's some things in the code right now that don't match at least how GMB runs a project, which could benefit the code, I think, by adding some of those things like what you're talking about.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I need to look at that a little closer.
Well, now you have homework.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think once this flow diagram's done, we have to look at a lot of code references moving forward. So we're really at a high level point even with the subdivision preliminary and final. The code where we have to really brush that off once we get direction from the committee of what to do with the code, of how to change it.
Yeah, because based on this, I see the code just kind of a massive change and like where things are required, what's required. So,
Mhm.
but like everything that's in the code is still there. It's just we might be adding things and putting it into different locations, if that makes sense. So I don't want to scare anybody. I just think the layout should follow kind of like this format, if that makes sense. If you guys are
there's
liking
going to be a
this.
shuffle.
Yeah.
There's going to be a shuffle, of course.
Yeah.
I
gonna
like
mix up the
I like
cards.
the flow of this much better.
Me too.
It feels right. It makes sense, and I think balance is definitely the key word. So for pre-application meeting, I had a question. What would the developer expect, or what would you expect from the developer? Would there be a checklist, or is it something concrete?
So to me, and it's always been just the developer, engineer comes, sit down, brings me a draft of what they're looking to do, and we have a conversation.
Like
So
draft site plan,
like a
basically.
conceptual site plan,
Conceptual site
yeah,
plan.
you know,
Okay.
and then it's like, okay, well, by the way, here's your application packet. So maybe we take that offline and it's like, oh, you only get it now. So you can't come in ahead of time. And then, okay, here's your checklist for your preliminary plan. All these items need to be addressed for preliminary plan, you know, and then have it like kind of like we do now. And then it's like, okay, when you get all those done, submit your application. We're going to send it out for review. I'm going to review it. Charlie's going to review it. You know, we'll get that packet back together, all those comments, put a report together, and then it goes to the planning commission.
All right. And you'll give them the application packet at the pre-application meeting.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
How do they know what to bring to that meeting then if they haven't gotten the application packet yet?
Well, most of them are going to look at the code. Most of them are like repeat customers. We know who we're dealing with, or they're just going to, I mean, a lot of the engineers, that's, you know, it's a smaller community for engineers. And we all kind of like know each other and work with each other. And, you know, I think, you know, and again, if we give them the application form, I don't see a lot of the stuff changing what's required. I think it's going to increase what's kind of required for a preliminary plan to a degree. But, you know, having that conversation, because what I think what we want is before they go too far into their preliminary plan design, that they talk to us to make sure, like, you know, they're not putting something that doesn't comply with code somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times
Even
the
if-
checklist is filled out there because some things apply and other things don't. And someone like Janelle sitting there talking to them, she can help them understand these are the things that apply to your project and explain it a little bit better. And actually, instead of them moving forward and doing things that wouldn't apply, they would know that coming out of the meeting.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
just trying to ensure that we're making this transparent and easy to understand for someone who may be a new engineer moving to our community, you know, someone who hasn't been through the process before. We want to make sure that they know what they need to bring and what they need to do.
Yeah, and you know, I think when they call to set up the or email to set up the meeting, I'll kind of give them a list of like, hey, this is what we're looking for. Don't forget, this is the section of code you're dealing with, to make sure they kind of know where they're going.
Okay.
Because I always see my role as I don't make the decision, but my job is to help somebody get from A to Z. You know, so
I also think it would be great if we could change preliminary consent to preliminary review.
Yeah.
I think that is definitely one of the recommendations we make out of this subcommittee.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement on that.
Okay, cool.
That's the word.
Yeah.
We got consent right
other-
there. To
Yeah,
change
there
it
we
to,
go.
to
Consent
review.
on getting rid of consent.
My
Yes.
consent is only preliminary though.
Right. Oh. And I'm definitely, the more I look at this order of operations here, I think the more it makes sense to me. So I'm definitely in favor of that as well.
And I also think it gets mayor and council in earlier in the process and the public back in the process earlier instead of getting them back in at the final, which I think is tough for people, especially the public. It's like, well, now I have a public hearing and want things to change. And it's kind of tough to change when they've done everything the planning commission's asked and gotten all their agency approvals, and now we got to change it. But if I think we can get a recommendation from the commission with conditions or additional recommendations, and it goes to council, and the engineer has time to make some changes or take it to them, and then they get a shot to make their own recommendations based on that initial recommendation from the commission.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, Tom.
Okay, the next section, we'll dive into review standards and guidelines. Just some initial points. They're used to support development review, deliberations, and decisions. They're based on the plan review process and also the comprehensive plan. I think I mentioned this before. When it's possible, it's best to include visual references. One thing, and we'll talk about standards and guidelines, but one thing off the top is standards should be codified, meaning they're in the code and adopted by ordinance. Guidelines can be in a reference document, and but also should be adopted. And the city already has guidelines in other documents. I mean, you could look at the Quill report, the byways, Kings Highway, which has guidelines in it for street cross sections and things. So you could build upon things that are already out there, or you just reference those in a standard, but it's also good for other ones to look at a guideline manual if we move forward with that. So catch up on my notes. What's a standard and guideline? Standards are usually objective, quantitative measures, of design attributes. They include numbers, dimensions, and precise wording. They usually result in a narrow range of outcomes, but you could have a list of ones to pick from. They're typically mandatory. They use words such as shall or must. They don't have much flexibility beyond the defined range of options. So that's of standards. Guidelines are usually flexible qualitative measures of design attributes. They rely on descriptive language and words such as should or may that allows for a broad range of outcomes. They may or may not be mandatory, but as it says in the chart up there, it's mandatory to consider them. And we'll talk about these a little bit more. A quick analogy, speed limit. A standard would be the speed limit here is 65 miles per hour, maximum speed limit. Versus a guideline would be something where judgment's involved. It's operate a vehicle within safe limits given road conditions. So there are different ways at looking at how you're guiding someone or putting a standard on a certain aspect. Lewis uses both of them. I haven't looked at in details of is ones that are required a standard and ones that are encouraged out or guidelines, but in section 170.26 for standards, there's things in there for lots and open space, and some of them are listed as required and others as encouraged. So it's already some aspect of it in place. Go ahead and click forward. So they're not new, they're used extensively in the code. It's not only in the subdivision code, there's also in the zoning ordinance. Under cluster and historic resources and other things, you'll find design standards in there. There's a chapter, I think it's 177 for trees that has design standards, and other places. They're usually all drawn from the comprehensive plan policies. And one more click, So what we'll be looking at is trying to refine the standards and guidelines to balance consistency using standards while promoting responsive design and guidelines. And next click. And update the recommendations process. So if we click to the next one, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Let me pull up my slide. This is a table, and I know it's hard to read, but it's a shot at going through all of the standards and guidelines that are currently in the code and putting them into this table. And the table's broken down into 5 groups. There's no rhyme or necessarily an exact rhyme or reason to these 5 groups. It's based somewhat on the way they currently are set up, but also looking at other ordinances that people use. And as you recall, I said it varies by community. So a lot of communities will have things for site design and access design. Building design, you'll see more in cities or states that allow for review of appearance of buildings. Community facilities is fairly common too. Drainage and runoff is not as common, but especially coastal communities and communities that are dealing with things like sea level rise, you're going to see more and more different types and concerns with it. So what I did is I went through the ordinance and tried to capture all the ones that I could find and list other ones out that we probably need to look at to just give you a cross section of what we're talking about, just as a point to start discussions. I'm not saying these are the 5 categories or these are all the standards. Oh yeah, one other point. You may have a standard and a guideline for landscaping, let's say. So in site design, halfway down is landscaping. So we may have pretty specific standards, but there may also be guidelines with them. That's the way your current code's set up, where again, some are required and others are encouraged, but we'll have to look at how to break them out as we move forward. I said that earlier on, I made in passing look at how to apply recommendations. So, and Charlie brought this up earlier. Under the current preliminary consent in section 170(19)E, I'm sure many of the Planning Commission know the 23 considerations that are in there. They're considerations that I think were used to base conditions on and other things, but a lot of discussions, but there were some of them were specific, but most of them were vague, that like the design should reflect open space and scenic views. But there's not much to go with there of where is the open space. And as Nancy's group knows in annexation, you're trying to delineate what's open, what types of open space are out there, where are they, and scenic views is a whole other thing. My thought on this is to really consolidate everything into the standards and guidelines and place them in the same section in the code they're in, which is past, it's I forget what section, it's where 170(26), a lot of these other ones are at. And then reference them with some purpose statements in the preliminary review and reference them in this one section. So in preliminary review, we're not looking at making sure at that stage it's complying with it. We're making them aware of them. So I think it would be good to group them all together, list them out in these categories and have standards and guidelines in there, but have them in one place. And when we reference them, they're drawing from that. They should also, each group should have the standards in there. Each standard should have an intent statement. Like, what are you supposed to be doing with open space? It's a narrative, but then the standards are underneath that and the guidelines are underneath it. So that's one of the ways I think it works to pull them together. But I do think right now the preliminary consent, 23 considerations they help to provide some guidance, but not enough specificity to use them. So I think we should have them consolidated together. And again, it's only for reference. So at preliminary review stage, we would advise the applicant that they're going to need to meet this, but approval's not based on compliance with it. A preliminary review, it's only to make them aware of it. Compliance is required under final plan review. So the last thing I'll mention about these is how to update them. So an ideal update process. Again, this goes back to some of the material I was reading from the American Planning Association. It's ideal to review relevant policies for direction. So whoever's doing this is going back and looking at the comp plan, the Quill report, and other things where there are guidelines already in there and adopted, to pull them together, to visit local projects or models that can be used or drawn from, especially when we're doing visuals with photos or things like that. That's always good to do. Prepare descriptions with visuals for clarification. I think it would be helpful is to circulate a draft for feedback to key stakeholders to get input in this earlier in the process. And just to increase awareness about what's going on. And lastly, to use outreach techniques to promote the input, such as interactive webs or surveys and polling. So those are things that it's good to do to get buy-in as we move forward with these. And I don't know what form they would take, maybe start with one group and work through them. You can see that a lot of them already have some language, but I think we need to go through each of them to make sure, is it current? Is it reflecting what we're doing? Does it capture everything? Again, as I'll refer to the annexation subcommittee, they're looking at open space, and there's a lot of details with that, right, Nancy? That, to pull out what is it and where is it and things like that. And you've mentioned that, I think in one of your meetings, that some communities have an open space plan that really provides that and shows where it is, where Lewis doesn't. It has a greenway plan, but not an open space plan. So those are the things that I kind of feel moving forward. It's a lot of, these are really important, and to go through these as a group, I think will be helpful in development review processes in the future. With that, that's all I have to share with you, but definitely interested in your ideas or suggestions with it.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that presentation.
Awesome.
Yeah. I definitely think we can take a look at those standards and guidelines and try. It seems like it's a decently sized task to get it all broken down.
I think it's well worth it moving forward, as you're seeing, when we do preliminary consent and looking at the considerations and then the standards. There is a section on open space, but it doesn't really give enough, I think, to make consistent decisions, or even to say where is it and what is usable open space or not. So it's well worth the effort. Once it's there, they're never going to be perfect. There are always going to be things that you need to look at. But having them better, a good set of them, really helps the process in the future.
Tom, do you think one of the elephants on developers' backs and the developers' engineers' backs is when they're going through the final approval process, it goes to planning commission, and planning commission develops, a 6-page document of recommendations and conditions that the developer has to go back and address, which can take a while. It can take a long time to address a lot of those. And sometimes it's vague, sometimes it's pretty clear, but I think this will help with that, solve that a little bit by getting some of that out earlier. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's definitely the purpose. Again, going back to the whole purpose is to come up with a good decision that's reasonable across the board. For the applicant, for the residents, and for everybody involved. And that's why I think it's good to have the early meetings and input. And it's good to have standards that can, I've heard developers say they just want to know what they need to do, and that's important to them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes guidelines are important because we don't know what's the best solution, but at least a guideline that they're aware of, and the ability to know what are some of the criteria. I think it will streamline the process in a good way of getting to good decisions. That's why I think that's why we're looking at other communities and references to give us some guidelines on it.
Yeah, because I think if we, I see kind of that happening because Planning Commission at this point would only get one shot at it. Now, if they want, like, if they have a question and need more information, they can definitely ask for that. I think that's definitely reasonable. So say like, hey, a TIS needs to be done. I could understand Planning Commission not wanting to make a recommendation until that transportation impact study has been completed and they have those recommendations, because that could significantly impact that. But I think they'll still come up with some conditions and recommendations that they want to see, but that it gets to mayor and council faster. That applicant has more time to play with it, and make those changes. And then council then has that final decision, if that makes sense. I think, commission gets to see it once, but we're trying to give them more understanding of what's required at that point, kind of like beefing up the standards and the guidelines, like Tom said, and going, okay, this is, if we're going to take a look at all the design standards, it's like, okay, this is what you have to have. By the way, this is what's required at Planning Commission stage. Okay, I need a landscape plan. If you're short 5 trees, that's okay, because we all know those 5 trees are going to have to be required before it gets finalized. So understanding that, you're not going to see the perfect final plan, but the nuts and bolts are there.
Parks
Yeah, I
and-
think, Charlie, that sometimes
Be involved.
conditions are there because there's not enough standards and there's not enough, people don't have enough information to base their decisions. And hopefully there'll always be conditions because an applicant may not be able to do everything at preliminary or show everything, or they're short 5 trees. But that's not a reason not to move forward. It's just to say you're short 5 trees. And that's going to be required at final. And, if we need to let them know that.
Okay.
Joe, did you have a comment?
No, I was going to say that's Parks and Recreation's venue, talking about trees and locations and types and sizes, and there's general guidelines, but there's a lot of flexibility with trees.
Right, but you need to make sure that street trees are shown on a landscape plan when it comes before you guys. So that's why I just pick trees. So
We love trees, right, guys?
Oh,
It's
They
all
kill
about
people.
the trees. And we have a Bragg Groom tree here too in town. It's all about the trees. Yeah, so I'll definitely will take a look. I think we should all take a look at, was it 170-19E, correct?
Those are what preliminary consent standards, right?
Yeah,
And
if we all just kind of have a little bit of homework to look over those standards before our next meeting, and maybe have some general input onto how to beef them up, or what your thoughts are about the standards versus guidelines.
and I also think, are some of those really more the purpose statement?
That's what I was thinking.
'Cause
Gonna
I'm
say, it's
thinking
the intent of the standard. And I think what we could do, that's how I was thinking of consolidating, that a lot of those are, you should be protecting open space and scenic views. Well, that's the lead in for the open space standards and the, scenic views parts, if we're including those. So I think, John, to your point, it would be good to look at that last slide, the categories and the standards, and then maybe think about how they're all being pulled together. What I'm really interested in is knowing too, are we missing anything that you think's important, or things that shouldn't be in there, or a different category or something like that? But then I think we can support by coming back and consolidating things, and maybe coming up with some, I'm not going to touch open space because I know the annexation team's working on that and they're going to give us their input. But maybe we could start looking at other communities and looking at some standards if they seem slight, to help to give you some guidance moving forward, is to bring them all together.
Sounds good to me. Makes sense. All right, so
One more question, just for reference, as we're reviewing this before the next meeting. Are there any common complaints you get from the public, Janelle, about the way in which we do these public meetings, or the information that's made available to the public beforehand or available during the meeting?
Well, I think I think we require almost everything up front. Even when somebody's doing a presentation, I try to get it up front so I can get it on the website.
Mhm.
I think it's more, where are we in the process? Because I can tell you we've got multiple people interested in multiple different developments. Like, where are we?
Mhm.
It's where are we? And I think if we can clean that up,
Mhm.
I think that helps a lot of their questions. And I think if we start, reaching out to some of the agencies ahead of time to get some of their comments. And again, we're going to have conversations with the agencies. To me, it's like a mini plus process. We give them an application like, hey, give us our comments back. So it's a city review process. And we're reaching out to some of those agencies and going, okay, make sure, and it's not like we expect them to, do a full, they're going to fix their plan. It's just, okay, they've
Yeah.
submitted the plan based on this. We've got all these comments. We know they're going to have to fix it. And then I think that also helps the public as well, because they're seeing that, yep, Charlie's reviewed it, Janelle's reviewed it, Conservation District's given some comments, Fire Marshal, because you guys get the question a lot. Does that turnaround meet fire code? And I think if we goes like, yep, the fire marshal says it doesn't, or
Yeah.
he knows, oh, by the way, it's going to have to, I think it just answers that question for everybody,
Yeah.
not for just you guys, but the public and everyone, that it's like, oh, this is what the code says. It might not be there now, but we know it's going to meet that because they've already said it has to.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that help?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Janelle,
Yes.
the one question keeps coming up is the fact that general public likes to say this is a high density development, and the developer should point out how many units per acre he has, how many are permitted, because the most common comment is the fact that the density needs to be reduced. You just throw it out there. They want it reduced density. But
Yeah. And
the owner can prove he's in it code, it's good.
And so my question for you, Joe, is that report for the Joint Site Development Ad Hoc Review Committee, was that helpful? The report that I did?
It was educational, yes.
Okay. So for everybody else, I just kind of went down like, okay, hey, there are wetlands on the site. This is how they're addressing wetlands. This is the entrance. This is where the location is. And I just kind of broke down like, and again, I just took a first stab at trying to do like a little report about what's going on with the site. So it kind of makes it easier for you guys to understand and the public to understand what's going on. Like, oh, they're athletic fields. Here's athletic fields over here, here, and here, and what kind they are. So I just try to explain it a little bit. But yeah, I'm just trying a different take on things. So,
Janelle, I found out when you look at a flooded field, it's actually, if there's been no rise in adjacent stream beds, it's actually just ponding. It's called ponding due to poor drainage, so that's why it looks like it's flooding, but it's not really right. It's poor drainage, which results in ponding, and that's it.
Yep, that happens too.
I think one thing I wanted to point out too is that I mentioned that there's some standards in zoning, and many of them are in the subdivision ordinance. But there's a key consideration with that, in a subdivision ordinance, an applicant can request a waiver, and you see that happening more and more. That strict numbers often can't be met, and sometimes it's better, leads to more favorable design with certain types of waivers over others. Whereas if they're in the zoning ordinance, you can't get a waiver for them. You need a variance, and that's not really. It's a much higher
Standard.
standard to
Yeah.
get to. So, for instance, the open space standards for cluster are in the zoning ordinance. It might be that something like that the required, the percentage of open space and things like that, meaning the use itself stays in zoning, but some of those design elements get shifted over to a subdivision ordinance because it's no less applicable, but it's usually easier to manage and then to use guidelines with them when you don't have explicit standards to use on them. So that's something I think the group should look at as you move forward.
All right. Thank you. So far we all agree to change the name of preliminary consent to preliminary review. Require the pre-application meeting, and where they're expected to bring a conceptual site plan. And are we good? Was everybody happy with the draft order for the steps to preliminary review that we had drafted?
Just so
Okay.
everybody listening, there are nodding heads.
Right, yes, these are
They're
verbal
nodding
yeses.
yes in the
Yes,
affirmative.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, and then for next meeting, we're gonna look over 17019E. So could we, well, let's see, it's 4:35. I'd like to try to finish up before 5 o'clock, if that's okay with everybody, or do we need to go earlier than that?
Whenever you guys are done,
All right,
we're
So-
okay.
could you bring up the other document that you sent out, or Janelle, not the flow chart, but the other one,
The Charlie chart
Charlie chart?
one. It's not a chart. Sorry, Charlie. The
Yeah,
Charlie
and
comments.
I'm gonna preface that now by, after our discussion today, saying that I want to say probably at least 50% of my comments might go into a different section of any revised code that we were just talking about. Like if we're moving things from final to preliminary, some of my comments might be relocated based on that. But I do have some
Okay.
pretty serious ones in here too.
All right,
Like-
well, which ones would you like to start with?
So maybe just talk about this lot grading plan. And this is something that I've been working with the city, mainly Anne Marie and Robin Davis, to confirm that any particular lot in any subdivision that goes through this process doesn't adversely affect by drainage their neighboring properties. So we've added a whole step in here about review by the building official, review by GMB to make sure that the grading plan is acceptable, and then issuing a lot grading certificate that it is acceptable once that review's been completed. And it's not just these two red sentences here. There's a process that's been added, and Robin and I and Anne Marie have been talking about it for several months now. So that's a big one, because I think, you guys need to be aware that that's something that we want to add to the code to eliminate the issue of drainage problems on adjacent properties.
I recall when this came up, when I first started with it actually came up, I think, before several months ago. And I think the planning commission was going to take this on, and Anne Marie had said that you guys were working on this. So I definitely would like to get this on the books, because currently there is no lot grading requirements would this apply to redevelopment, or is this only in subdivisions? Redevelopment,
Right.
or if you buy an empty lot, are you going to have to go through this? Because I know that pretty much anybody, I mean, it's happening right next to me. It happens to pretty much everybody who buys an empty lot in town. They raise their property up.
Yeah.
And then it just automatically causes problems between neighbors. I see it on my street, and it's awful. So I would definitely like to get this on the books sooner than later.
We can talk to Anne Marie and Robin about those redevelopment sites, but for our purposes, it's been incorporated into the subdivision code. That language is easily transferable to those redevelopment sites somewhere, somehow.
So you can
Yeah.
just pick that up and put it in another section and cover the rest of the town.
Yeah, I mean, it would be outside chapter 170 because that's specific to the subdivision.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
of course.
we
So
might be
that
able to
makes
find a
sense, yeah.
section that it could fit
All
into.
right. Well, hopefully we could do that.
John,
think
I have
that's-
John, I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yes, sir.
On, if you can page back up, whoever, scroll down, on the item D, it says the individual lot grading plan has been reviewed by the city engineer. So it would also say and approved rather than just reviewed. No, I don't want to put Charlie on the spot.
Well, the lot grading certificate that's required at the bottom of that paragraph is an indication of the approval.
Okay, so it's under,
Yeah.
there it is. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
approved.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I
and we
blanked.
don't, yeah, okay. And at what step of the process would that be required? That would be before preliminary review?
So
No.
this
It'd be
is
after,
more
right?
tied to, so there's a grading plan holistically. And it sounds like Charlie wants to make sure that when that grading plan is done, then I come in with my building permit and I go, here's my building permit. I got to show those lines and grades to make sure they match the approved grading plan so that I'm not building my house up 3 feet taller than what was
Yeah.
originally approved. So I don't end up negatively draining into my neighbor. And then I'm
Yes.
guessing before a CO verifying it.
Yes.
Yep.
That's the process. Yep.
Okay.
Because Robin will be involved with this with me.
Okay.
Okay. And then Charlie wants a definition for a dead end street. I agree.
Yeah. It's
Oh, yeah,
referred.
this is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I mean, it's referred in the code, so I just felt like it was it's gotten us into a little bit of a pickle from time to time, so I wanted to add something in there.
Yeah. And on the topic of definitions overall, I think it'd be smart if we eventually maybe just look at the definitions that are like this more specific to 170 and focus on those, but not go through all the definitions together as one, especially where they're already defined in other areas of the code or of the city. But having dead end street is definitely a plus, I think.
Charlie, is there
Janelle?
any need for a dimensional requirement there? I know Del Dot has a dead end street can't be longer
Oh,
than, what is it, 500 feet or so?
Yeah, that's in a
Mhm.
different section of code that I think we definitely need to talk about.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
the standards in there, that's good. It shouldn't be in the definition, but I was just wondering. Thank you, Janelle.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's 200 feet. And I know there've been discussions about that because the majority, I think, of the dead end streets in the city are much longer than 200 feet.
Right, yeah.
It's in the cul-de-sac section
Yeah.
Yeah.
where it talks about the T turnaround, and I think I might have addressed it in this comments about extending it from 200 to 300.
Mhm.
Because I think that's what the state fire marshal allows.
Yeah.
Janelle, can you scroll back to alley definitions? There we go. Okay. It doesn't include carriage houses. We do have some carriage houses here that basically load off of the back alley. And they say no dwelling or stores front, but serves as a rear entrance to 2 or more properties. I'm just wondering if we're missing out on carriage houses, which are built over garages, which basically typically face alleys. I think we're missing something. Maybe I am.
I think we can definitely take a look at that.
Yeah. I have to add carriage houses. All right, thank you.
Sure. And then this is all the individual lot grading plan that Charlie was talking about.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail in here if you want to take a look at it and offer any comment to me. I don't know that we want to go through it today.
Yeah, we got 48 pages.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I like to
But
know
I
what
think, and again,
BMB
then
stands for.
I'm sorry,
BMB, scroll back down.
best
it's
management
supposed to be-
practice.
No, no,
Yeah, BMP. Yeah, okay.
BMB.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a type. That's what's called a typo.
Okay.
It's supposed to be.
Ah,
Nah, I think it's supposed to be BMP.
I thought it was an engineering company.
No,
Oh, okay.
sorry about that. Yeah, I caught that afterwards and just forgot about it.
All right.
Sorry.
So did I. Very good, folks. Thank you.
Anyway, those are definitions for the lot grading plan and the lot grading certificate.
Yeah. Was there another big item that you wanted to focus on, Charlie?
Oh, shucks.
Sorry, I'm putting Charlie on the spot. And I think, as Charlie has said, I think a lot of this is gonna, based on Tom's proposal, is gonna change slightly, because we're gonna take a lot of these categories, group them together, give them like that purpose statement, which I think we've kind of agreed a lot of the purpose statements are already in the code. They're the 20 some odd items, conditions are more the purpose statement, and put those with the categories and kind of flesh out the categories a little bit more. If everybody's good with that.
Could you just scroll through and see where I have comments on the right margin, because they might have been the ones where.
Yeah, we can do better to find that.
Yeah, that's kind of falls into what we've already talked about.
Yep, so is that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna have to make sure this all
Oh,
reflects.
Yeah, that's just
Yeah.
as we're moving forward. Yep.
Yep. So I think there's a lot of cleaning up that'll. So I'm if you just put in a word or two, I'm just kind of skimming it.
Have you
Yeah.
got, do these changes include making the changes that might be required to match the new process?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to take some of these and put them into the new process.
Okay.
Yeah, Nancy, I did not do that.
Yeah, I think what he was just doing was like, okay, I know there's a problem with this section of code. This is
Yeah.
my suggestion to address it, which is perfect. Because as we go through and, look at, this section of code, like the whole process, yeah, we can clean everything up and
Yeah, I
make
think
sure
we
it
were
goes in the
looking
right
for-
spot.
I would think we were looking for direction from the group before we do that, because
Yeah,
make a change in a flow, it could change an entire section, but now we're getting a little bit clearer focus. We can dive into the code now.
and kind of
Okay.
start making those changes.
I just wanted to clarify, so, because I have not gone through it in what you've set out in this portion, what you've set out in detail yet. And as I was going through, I just wanted to know.
That's fine. I thought there were a few things that I said something like GMB would have to provide additional language
Yeah.
if this. Yeah.
Yeah, because you added the turnaround.
Well, one-way streets are kind of a big one, but maybe take a
Yes.
look at that. Yeah.
And you've got
Sarah, they-
defining what a public stormwater drain is to be added somewhere, I think, too.
Yeah. But definitely these one-way streets, because there's nothing in the code right now that talks about a one-way street and what the right-of-way width or paving width would be. And if we want to add something, I could add the language and those requirements related to that.
I'm in favor.
Yeah, and
Nancy's
they're like on
going,
Fisher.
she likes the idea of a
agree.
one-way street.
Yeah, that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joe, what's your feeling?
Neutral.
Neutral, okay. So I think we got 2 out of the 3 saying they kind of okay with one-way streets, so it's okay for Charlie to kind of look at
Yeah,
information about a one-way street. Yes? Okay.
Okay, I'll provide that. So at the committee level, is neutral the same as abstain?
I'm trying to read these as they're scrolling by. I'm hurting.
And again, I think, I'm just,
I know.
This is kind of a big one where
okay.
whether we want to encourage permeable paving somehow in our subdivision code.
Mm.
Yeah, and is there an incentive to encourage that or something? Because we know it costs a little bit more, but then even on the city side for maintenance, it requires more work. But we all know it's better. So,
Somebody tell me what fog sealing is?
Charlie?
Fog sealing it's just like there's subtle differences between seal coating, fog sealing, microsurfacing, and tar and chip, but they're all roughly the same thing. They're not like asphalt that's being milled and overlaid. It's just a seal
Okay.
over the top. And it's more with a pressurized heated gun that they do the fog sealing.
Keeps the fog out. Okay.
Yeah, but with regard to the permeable paving, there is no standard specification inside Chapter 170 right now. So if we want to, encourage that, I think we should add those in there based on the city's experience on, other projects that we've done. We have a really good, strong standard on porous asphalt and a permeable concrete paver section. So we should think about whether we want to add those standards into the code to encourage that kind of installation.
That would go
I'm
for
in-
sidewalks, I guess, too, right, Charlie?
Yeah, sidewalks too. Yep.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm in favor of that. I like how it's in here, it's written, assume poor soils, but if you're saying your soil can drain, you can get a test and prove that.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be requiring permeable, it would be strongly encouraging it. And if there is poor soils, they're going to have to use something permeable, correct?
Well, if there's poor soils, a permeable system won't work because the underlying
right.
soil conditions have to
Gotcha.
drain properly.
That's
But
So,
right.
yeah.
I will say, like, for example, on Verdon Subdivision, his drainage of the road at the beginning of the process he was draining the road into those swales along the side of the road, but there wasn't any outfall to those. So Janelle and I went back and forth with them a few times, and finally they said, hey, okay, we're going to put the porous asphalt in. But as part of that, John, he has to get a test to prove that it'll work. And he's pretty sure it's going to work. I'm pretty sure it's going to work just based on what I know about the soils at that location. But that's still a requirement, yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And maybe we can look at an incentive to encourage that. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, because so I'm giving
like
Tom
in our-
more homework.
Density bonus. Yes.
Oh, how about money back or something from the application
I
process?
think there's
I
just
don't know.
something we need to look at if
Yeah.
just to get our heads thinking, because I know what we're doing with the annexation is okay. We want to give you some flexibility, but we also want to give something back. It's like a little bit of give and take. And I think if we're trying to encourage permeable pavement and sidewalks, we're gonna have to find a little carrot to kind of get them there.
Reduced engineering fees.
Well, one of the carrots would be that their stormwater management system wouldn't have to be as large as, and it could free up space for additional lots. It depends on the development.
Right.
So anyway, just keep
Okay.
scrolling. That might almost be it.
Okay.
but Let's see.
Oh, intersections.
Yeah.
I think that's just some cleanup that needs to be done.
Oh,
Yeah. I need to.
yeah.
I need to do that.
Okay.
That was me saying I need to do something, but not actually having done it yet.
I make those notes as well.
One thing about the porous sidewalk, Tom, is that it's a little bit of a different animal in that the more porous a sidewalk gets, the less it looks good, because it's got more porosity, so it doesn't look like a standard sidewalk anymore.
Mhm.
It starts to begin to look like, well, some people might like it. It starts to look like open graded sidewalk or exposed
Just an
aggregate.
old sidewalk.
Yeah, exposed aggregate like we have on
Character.
Coleman Avenue. Yeah, some people's character. Yeah, for sure. Just keep that in mind though.
It's Lewis. We like older things. We like our history. So we're gonna
Yeah,
make
no,
it.
I'm with you.
We're gonna keep it the historic look, Charlie. That's what we're gonna call it.
Good idea. Yeah.
And then you've got some sewer items.
Yeah, it doesn't address pump stations,
Oh,
which should have been addressed 50 years ago in here, but I will add
Oh,
that
yeah.
language because I provided that to Lewis Waterfront Preserve and Fisher's Cove already. So I've got all that language that can be added in.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Cool. Good.
What does that say
Yeah.
above that?
Stormwater management.
Oh, yeah, that's what Nancy was talking about.
Stormwater
Yeah.
drain. Yep. I got
Yep.
that on my list.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm starting to see Tom's categories, and it's like, okay, we got utilities, we got site design, we got, all these categories, stormwater management, drainage, and it's like, how do we take what we've already got in code, take some of those 19, 20 items, put those into kind of like the purpose statement, and then kind of give these a little bit more heft, and then figure out at what point do we need what? Because we don't need it all at preliminary, because I don't think,
Mhm.
because I think at preliminary, I expect a little give and take. Like, okay, well, and if they've fully designed it, there's less give and take. So I think, preliminary, we want that conversation about, it's like, well, I want this a little bit here. So they're not fully designed, so we can play a little bit and get good discussion going.
I think the main thing is to make sure the applicants, engineers, and group are aware of them. We want to see them. I remember one of them recent developments with a pump station. It moved around somewhat from its original location. And that's not uncommon, because as you do more engineering, I think, and sizing pipes and other things, that happens. But we need to know that if there is a pump station, show it, and if we can, at least represent it, but at least let them know there's a lot more standards that are required for a pump station than just showing it on a map in a final plan review.
Right, because at final, they'll have to have all of everything approved. But preliminary, it's like, okay, you're putting a pump station. Have a good idea. Like, if it has to switch the side of the road, we understand that. But it's not like it's going from one side to the other side. I think we're trying to get a little bit more information.
Question for Janelle or Charlie.
Mhm.
BPW wants to put up a new water tower. Do they need our blessing?
I'd have to check code to look at that, because I don't know off the top of my head is the answer.
Well, I know they're planning a new water tower, but it's outside city limits, so that's.
Oh, then it's outside city limits, so
that's
they
for the
deal with.
county, yeah, but I mean, if they want to put up another water tower, which will be a monster, somewhere, do they have to go work for the city?
I don't know is
Okay.
the answer I have off the top of my head. I'd have to look and see if it qualifies for any of our review processes, and then
Okay.
whatever agreements we have with BPW.
Right.
So it sounds like, yep, that's it. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
I think things will move around, Charlie, but I'm glad you're giving thought to the details, or things that you've seen from past experiences, that the details are there now. So we might shift them around as we look at continuing to refine this, but I encourage anybody who's got experiences in development review and knows about landscaping or streets or any of these categories, even if you don't know the standard, just tell us what the need was or the objective, and we can locate some things to give as a standard language or a guideline, and look for material to support it.
Yeah, I got to thinking today about the work that you did, Tom, you and Janelle did on the 5G. And I know we have that section or paragraph in chapter 170 that's called other utilities.
Right.
I don't think it goes into much detail at all in that paragraph.
Yeah.
But you went into a lot of detail, with those requirements.
Yeah, that's one of those emerging conditions, right? In just 10 years, it goes from not having it to having lots of detail to try and cover and address it.
Yeah, natural gas would be another one, but I think we would have to defer to the supplier of the gas in terms of standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's coming for sure.
I see.
Anybody else have? Sorry.
Sorry. I was just saying, I see that we're coming up to 5 o'clock, and I'm just wondering if we want to, while people are still on, look at dates for.
Calendar
Next
time,
week. Yep.
exactly.
Yeah, because it sounds like we've got some homework, and I think we've got some bigger items to work on. So do you guys, let's see. We could meet next week, but I think it's a short week and it sounds like we've got a lot of work to do. So maybe
Yeah.
the week after or the week of planning commission. So the week of the 7th or the week of the 14th, and the Sunday is the 6th and the 13th. I always start on Mondays because that's where.
Gotcha.
The more the better for me, but I'm just one person. The more time, the better.
So maybe the week of the 14th,
Yeah.
because I think
That's what I'm
Tom and I
saying.
are going to have a lot of stuff to work on, and I think we'd rather give you something good, and kind of like at least start with a section and see what we're thinking, and then of course, as you guys over the next couple of weeks start coming up with ideas, just email them to us so that we can start implementing as
Okay.
we go along. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah.
So the week of the 14th, Planning Commission is that 16th. And I think it might be a good idea to show them the revised chart on Planning Commission just to make sure what they think. What do you think? You guys think?
Mhm.
Yeah, I definitely think
Well-
now that we have more
Yeah.
substantive changes, we have something to actually bring to them and say, here, this is our direction. This is where we're heading. Here's some of the recommendations we're planning on making. Show them the new revised flow chart. If we get the meeting before, which the 14th would be the only date I have before the 16th, because I'm not available the 15th.
Okay.
So if we get it before, we can give them an even bigger update. But as of right now, I definitely want to get word out to them and everybody else of what we got to so far.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put Tom's presentation on the website this afternoon.
Perfect.
And I think just to start getting some feedback on just the flow chart, what do you guys think about me reaching out to some engineers and getting their just initial thoughts?
Sure, sounds good.
Looks good. Yeah.
Okay. Because they can always kind of give us ideas, because I think we've learned that it's like the more outreach we do and the people we talk to, and you know, to get that out there. Okay, so we're looking maybe Monday, June 14th.
Good for me.
Joe's good. John, I
Mhm.
know you're good at like 3:30. Charlie's good. Tom's good. Nancy,
Good.
good. So
We can
June,
start at 3 if you
3
guys want
p.m.?
to start a half hour earlier.
Yeah, because there's a city council meeting that night.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is. Okay, so
So
at
if we can
3.
do 3.
Here, let me quick make sure there's nothing else on that calendar, on the city calendar that night. Make sure there's not like something.
I
good
don't know
gonna
what
sneak up.
happened with this meeting, but for a while on the city's calendar, it was shown as being at 12:30.
Yeah, there was an
Yeah.
issue there. I apologize.
Okay.
Okay, so we're good on the city calendar. We just need to be done before 6:30 because that's when council starts.
4:30, guys. Hour and a half sessions. All right.
Yeah, that's definitely good.
No, I think we got a lot done today in this time. Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate it. And I'm actually looking forward to our next subcommittee meeting.
Great.
Okay,
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, John. Yep.
everybody have enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yeah,
You
have
too.
great
Okay.
weekends, everybody.
Bye-bye,
Yes.
everybody.
Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Bye.